Flint Hills, Kansas, August 1882. The sun was a hammer, beating the prairie grass into a pale, brittle gold. In that immense, rolling emptiness, the sight of a man digging a hole the size of a cabin foundation was strange enough. But Sandor Feketakuti wasn't digging a foundation. He was digging the house itself. Day after day, he and his hired team of oxen strained, scraping away the rich topsoil, then the dense clay, then the stubborn, rocky subsoil. The pit grew, a precise rectangle sunk deep into the earth, its walls sheer and sharp. By mid-August, it was over 8 feet deep. The other homesteaders, men who had built their lives out of logs and sod laid carefully on top of the prairie, not buried within it, would stop their wagons on the faint track that passed for a road. Brevard Hollis, a rancher whose herds grazed over 1,000 acres and whose house was the largest in the county, was a frequent observer. He'd rein in his horse, lean on the saddle horn, and watch with a look of profound amusement. "Feketakuti," he called out one afternoon, his voice carrying easily in the still, hot air. "I've seen men build soddies, and I've seen men build with timber hauled from the river. I've even seen a man try to build with limestone. But I've never seen a man try to bury his family alive." Caleb Finch, the town carpenter, stood beside him, shaking his head. "It'll be a damp, miserable grave, Brevard. The rot will take the timbers in 2 years." Sandor Feketakuti paused, straightened his back, and wiped a line of sweat from his brow with the back of a calloused hand. He looked up at the men silhouetted against the blinding sky. He said nothing. Hollis laughed, a booming sound that startled a meadowlark from the grass. "You're not building a home, man. You're digging a den. Planning to live like a prairie dog, are you?" The mockery was sharp, public, and delivered with the unshakable confidence of a successful man. To the other settlers who measured a man's worth by the height of his cabin and the straightness of his roofline, the Hungarian was clearly a fool. A madman, digging his own tomb in the middle of the Kansas prairie. What did this Hungarian cellar mason understand about geothermal stability that these experienced plainsmen, masters of timber and sod, had missed? They saw a man digging a hole. He saw a man reaching for a constant, predictable warmth that the prairie offered freely to anyone willing to look down instead of up. If you stick with me for the next few minutes, I promise you will learn the simple, powerful physics that allowed one immigrant family to thrive while their neighbors froze. It's a principle that modern architecture is only now rediscovering. Let me know in the comments below what you think is the single biggest challenge of surviving a brutal winter on the open plains. Sandor Feketakuti was not a farmer. He was not a carpenter. And he was certainly not a frontiersman in the way Americans understood the term. In the old country, in the rolling hills of Tokaj in Hungary, he was a pincemester, a cellar master. His hands knew the feel of volcanic tuff, the heft of stone chisels, the precise angle of an arch that could bear the weight of a hill. He didn't work with wood. He worked with the earth itself. His trade was carving vast, cool, silent labyrinths into the hillsides, wine cellars that held a constant temperature year-round, protecting the precious Tokaji wine from the sweltering summers and bitter winters. He understood thermal mass not as a theory, but as a lived reality. He knew in his bones that 10 feet of earth was a better blanket than 10 inches of wood. He had come to America with his wife Ilona and their 2 small children, Laszlo and Zsofia, for the promise of land. The poster in Budapest had shown a neat, timbered farmhouse on a gentle rise, a puff of welcoming smoke rising from its chimney. The reality, they discovered, was a brutal, wind-swept sea of grass that would test a man to his breaking point. Their first winter in 1881 was the crucible that forged Sandor's strange new plan. They had built a small, conventional cabin, just as their neighbors had, with cottonwood logs chinked with mud and grass. They had a good cast-iron stove, and a mountain of firewood stacked against the west wall. It was not enough. The Kansas winter descended not as a gentle season, but as an invading army. The wind was a physical force, a relentless pressure that found every tiny crack in the chinking. It didn't just carry the cold, it drove it through the walls. Sandor remembered that winter as a series of desperate, failing battles. The stovepipe would glow a dull, dangerous red, devouring wood at an astonishing rate, yet the heat barely reached the corners of the single room. Ilona would place a pail of water just a few feet from the stove, only to find it cracked by morning, a solid block of ice, pushing its bottom out. The worst was the air itself. They could see their breath hanging in clouds indoors, not just in the morning, but long past noon. Laszlo and Zofia slept in their coats, huddled together under every blanket they owned, their coughs a constant worrying rhythm in the frozen dark. Sandor felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the temperature. His traditional above-ground house was a sieve, leaking precious heat into an infinitely cold sky. He was failing his family. One night, as he fed another log into the insatiable stove, watching the flames roar while his feet remained numb, he thought of the wine cellars back home. Cool in the summer, yes, but also not frozen in the winter. They held their temperature. The earth, he realized, was not the enemy. The air was the enemy. The failure of the standard frontier cabin was not a failure of effort or materials. It was a failure of physics. Men like Jedediah Stone, a neighbor 2 miles to the east, built with pride. His logs were hand-hewn, perfectly notched. His chinking was meticulous. And yet, his cabin was a thermal disaster. The problem wasn't the stove. The problem was heat loss, which attacked in 3 distinct ways. First was conduction. Heat naturally moves from a warm area to a cold one. The thin 12-inch logs of a typical cabin wall had an R value, a measure of thermal resistance, of about 14. A modern insulated wall is R19 to R25. But even that number was theoretical. The logs were a bridge, conducting the precious warmth from inside straight out into the frigid air. You could put your hand on the inside wall of Jedediah's cabin and feel the deep, penetrating cold of the wood itself. Second, and far more devastating, was convection. The wind, that relentless Kansas wind, created a pressure differential. It forced cold, dense air through 1,000 invisible gaps in the chinking, around the window frames, under the door. This process, called air infiltration, was like leaving a window open all winter. Every cubic foot of warm air that was painstakingly heated by the stove was immediately pushed out by a cubic foot of Arctic air from outside. You could watch a candle flame flicker and bend sideways in Jedediah's cabin, a visual indicator of the drafts that were stealing his warmth and his firewood. He was trying to heat the entire state of Kansas. Finally, there was radiation. Every warm object, including the human body, radiates heat to colder objects around it. In a poorly insulated cabin, the interior walls were so cold that they acted like thermal vampires, sucking the warmth directly from the bodies of the people inside. This is why, even if the air temperature near the stove was 70 degrees, a person sitting 10 feet away would feel a persistent chill. Their own body heat was radiating away to the frigid logs. The result was a brutal equation. To maintain a livable temperature, a family had to burn an immense quantity of fuel. A typical family might burn through 15 to 20 cords of wood in a single winter, a staggering amount of labor to fell, buck, split, and stack. Martha Gable, a widow with 3 children, spent most of her meager savings on wood, and her sons spent every waking hour hauling it. Still, her cabin was a place of misery, where the fight against the cold was a losing day-to-day struggle. These settlers weren't lazy or foolish. They were building according to the inherited wisdom of the forested lands they had come from. But the Flint Hills were not the Ohio Valley. Here the rules were different. The wind was the master, and the air was a sea of cold. Sandor Fekatakuti's solution was to refuse to play the game. He would not build in the air. He would build in the earth. The construction was a spectacle. After the pit was dug, a perfect rectangle 24 feet long, 18 feet wide, and 8 feet deep, he began the real work of a cellar mason. He hired a wagon to haul fieldstone from the creek beds. He wasn't building flimsy retaining walls. He was laying a foundation of immense stability 2 feet thick at the base, mortared with a mixture of clay and lime. These stone walls rose from the floor of the pit to a height of 7 feet, creating the solid, immovable perimeter of his home. This was the work he knew, the patient, precise laying of stone upon stone. Caleb Finch, the carpenter, came by again, this time offering what he considered helpful advice. "Sandor, you have to put in a vapor barrier, tar paper at least. If you don't, the damp will come right through that stone. Your bedding will mold. Your flour will spoil. You'll be sick before Christmas." Sandor paused from setting a heavy cornerstone. He looked at the carpenter, then at the dry, sun-baked clay walls of the pit. "The water is down deep," he said, his English thick but clear. "This high the earth is dry." He simply returned to his work. The roof was the most ingenious part. He laid heavy cottonwood beams, salvaged from a washed-out bridge, across the stone walls. On top of these, he placed a tight layer of 1-inch thick planks. Then came the part that baffled everyone. He layered tar paper not for moisture from the ground, but for moisture from above. On top of the tar paper, he and Elona carefully placed a thick layer of prairie sod, cut in dense, root-filled rectangles. But they placed it upside down, with the grass facing down against the tar paper. This created a dense, tightly packed layer of soil. On top of this inverted sod, they piled the excavated earth, a layer nearly 2 feet thick, carefully graded and tapered to blend seamlessly with the surrounding prairie. When they were done, the roof was not a roof at all. It was just land. They planted the same native grasses on top. By the time the first rains of September came, the roof had begun to grow. The only entrance was a single, protected door on the south-facing side. It didn't open flush with the ground, but at the bottom of a deep, angled, stone-lined staircase that acted as a cold trap, preventing the wind from ever blowing directly into the house. 2 small, deep-set windows were also placed on the south wall to catch the low winter sun. A single, sturdy stone chimney rose from the center of the earthen roof. When it was finished, from 100 yards away, the Fektakuti home was invisible. All that could be seen was a gentle, grassy mound, a single stovepipe puffing smoke, and a dark slash in the earth that was the entrance. Brevard Hollis made one final visit before the first snow. He sat on his horse, staring at the chimney pipe sticking out of the ground. "Well, Fekatakuti," he drawled, unable to keep the scorn from his voice. "You've done it. You've built the damnedest prairie dog town I've ever seen. I'll be sure to send word when we find your frozen bodies in the spring." Sandor was fitting the heavy wooden door at the bottom of the stairs. He looked up at Hollis, a glint in his eye. "In my house," he said quietly, "the walls are 2 feet of stone and 8 feet of earth. What are your walls made of, Mr. Hollis?" To understand why Sandor was so confident, you have to understand the fundamental physics he was exploiting: geothermal stability. The surface of the Earth experiences wild temperature swings, from over 100 degrees Fahrenheit in the summer to well below zero in the winter. But that volatility is remarkably shallow. Below a certain depth known as the frost line, the temperature of the Earth remains almost constant year-round. This is because the Earth acts as an enormous thermal battery, All summer long, it absorbs the sun's energy. Its immense mass, trillions of tons of soil and rock, stores that heat with incredible efficiency. It takes months for the winter cold to penetrate even a few feet down, and by then, spring is already returning. In the Flint Hills of Kansas, the frost line is about 3 feet deep. Below that level, the ground holds a steady, reliable temperature of approximately 55 degrees Fahrenheit, day and night, all year long. This single fact changes the entire heating equation. Consider Brevard Hollis's well-built ranch house. On a January night when the outside temperature plunged to minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit, his stove had to fight an astonishing 80-degree temperature difference to keep the inside at a barely comfortable 70 degrees Fahrenheit. The British thermal units, or BTUs, required to bridge that gap were immense. Every surface of his house, the walls, the roof, the floor, was a battleground, constantly losing that expensive heat to the Arctic air. Now consider Sandor's dugout. The vast majority of his home's surface area, the floor and 3.5 of the walls, was not touching minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit air. It was touching 55 degrees Fahrenheit earth. The only significant exposure to the cold was the heavily insulated sod roof and the small, south-facing wall with its protected door and windows. To get his home to a comfortable 70 degrees Fahrenheit, Sandor's stove didn't have an 80-degree gap to bridge. It had a mere 15-degree gap. The earth itself was doing the heavy lifting. It was providing a baseline of 55 degrees for free. The energy required to heat a space by 15 degrees is exponentially less than the energy required to heat it by 80 degrees. Sandor wasn't just saving firewood, he was operating in a completely different thermal reality. The skeptics who worried about dampness failed to understand that below the frost line, the ground isn't a damp, muddy swamp. It's a zone of stable temperature and relatively low moisture, far removed from the freeze-thaw cycles of the surface. Sandor Fikitakuti hadn't buried his family in a cold, damp hole. He had nestled them inside a massive, perfectly insulated 55-degree thermal blanket. That winter, the prairie decided to test his theory with a vengeance. In early January of 1883, a storm system of unprecedented ferocity stalled over the Great Plains. It began not with a gentle snowfall, but with a blast of wind that was like a solid wall. The temperature plummeted 40 degrees in 3 hours. Then the snow began, fine and hard as sand, driven horizontally by the gale. For 9 consecutive days, the world vanished into a churning white chaos. It was a drifting blizzard, the kind that reshapes the landscape, burying fences, livestock, and entire cabins under mountainous dunes of snow. Inside Jedediah Stone's meticulously crafted log house, the situation was desperate. The wind screamed through the walls. The snow piled up against the north and west faces, reaching the eaves, plunging the single room into a perpetual twilight. Jedediah and his wife stuffed rags and spare clothes into the cracks around the window, but it was useless. The cold was a physical presence. They burned through their woodpile at a terrifying rate, the stove roaring day and night. By the 6th day, Jedediah was forced to start burning the split-rail fence that enclosed his yard. His children were sick, huddled under a mountain of blankets, too cold and miserable to move. At the Gable place, it was worse. Martha's woodpile was smaller, and by the 4th day, it was gone. She began burning furniture, first a broken chair, then a small table, then the cradle her youngest had outgrown. The smoke from the green, poorly burning wood filled the cabin, and the cold was relentless. But inside the Fikitakuti dugout, a different reality prevailed. The storm was not a roar. It was a distant, muffled whisper. The 2 feet of earth and sod on the roof absorbed the sound of the gale completely. There were no drafts, not one. The air inside was perfectly still. The only sound was the quiet crackle of the small fire in the stove. And it was a small fire. Sandor kept it fed with just a few logs at a time, maintaining a low, steady burn that kept the single, large room at a constant, comfortable temperature. The scene was one of surreal domestic peace. Ilona, finding their life utterly undisrupted by the blizzard of the century raging above, decided to make noodles for soup. She worked at the large wooden table in the center of the room, rolling out the dough until it was paper thin. In any other house on the prairie, the cold air would have made the dough stiff and impossible to work with. Here it was pliable and soft. Zofia sat on the floor, which was made of packed earth but covered with a few simple rugs, playing with a corn-husk doll. The floor wasn't warm, but it was not the soul-stealing cold of a wooden floor set over frozen ground. It was a neutral 55 degrees. Laszlo was at the table practicing his letters on a slate. The air was so calm and the light from the single oil lamp so steady that he could work for hours without strain. They were warm. They were safe. They were not just surviving. They were living, while the world above them was being torn apart. On the morning of the 10th day, the wind finally died. The silence was as profound as the noise had been. The sun rose on a world transformed, a blinding white desert of sculpted snowdrifts that had buried the familiar landscape. Brevard Hollis, his own ranch house having survived, but at the cost of half his winter wood supply, put on his heaviest coat and rode out to check on his cattle. The scene was devastating. Dozens of animals, caught in the open, had frozen where they stood, statues of ice half buried in the snow. Others had drifted into ravines and been suffocated by the snow. It was a financial catastrophe. As he rode across a high point of his land, surveying the damage, he looked over toward the quarter section claimed by the strange Hungarian. He expected to see nothing, perhaps the tip of a chimney pipe, sticking out of a 20-foot drift. Instead, he saw something that made him pull his horse to a sudden stop. In the middle of the vast, unbroken whiteness, there was a perfect dark green rectangle, a patch of prairie, roughly 20 by 30 feet, where the snow had not accumulated. It had melted, the grass was visible, and from the center of this impossible rectangle, a steady, lazy plume of gray smoke rose into the still, frigid air. He stared, his mind struggling to process the image. It was as if a piece of summer had been cut out and pasted onto the frozen winter landscape. He urged his horse forward through drifts that came up to the animal's chest. As he got closer, he saw the smoke was indeed coming from Fekatakuti's chimney. The heat from the house, rising through the 2 feet of earth, had been just enough to melt the snow from the roof, keeping it clear. He found the slanted cut in the snow that marked the entrance and dismounted. He walked down the stone steps, his boots crunching on the thin layer of wind-blown snow. He expected to enter a cellar, a place of damp, chilling air, smelling of earth and mold. He braced himself for the cold. He pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The Vindication was not an argument. It was a physical sensation. The air that met him was warm, not hot and dry like the air near a roaring stove, but a gentle uniform, an utterly still warmth. It was silent. He took off his hat, his gloved hands fumbling slightly. He saw the family at their table finishing a morning meal. They looked up, surprised, but not alarmed. Sandor nodded a greeting. "Mr. Hollis." Hollis was speechless for a moment. He looked around the room. It was simple, even sparse, but it was a home. It was clean, dry, and impossibly comfortable. His eyes landed on a small desk in the corner where Sandor kept his accounts. On the desk was a bottle of black ink and a pen. Hollis felt a jolt of recognition. The ink bottle on his own desk in his fine timbered house had frozen solid on the third night of the storm and cracked, leaving a black, icy stain on his ledger. This ink was liquid. It was a small, mundane detail, but it was the most powerful proof imaginable. It was the evidence of a place where the basic laws of winter had been suspended. Hollis finally found his voice, which was quiet and full of a new, profound respect. He looked at Sandor, at the simple stone walls, at the children in their shirt sleeves. "You didn't build a house, Fakatakuti," he said, the words coming slowly as the full realization dawned on him. "You built a season." News of the Fakatakuti dugout spread not through boasts, but through the quiet testimony of a man of God. In late February, a circuit-riding preacher named Micah Evans was caught in a sudden ground blizzard while traveling between settlements. Blinded by the snow, his horse exhausted, he stumbled upon the single chimney, puffing smoke from the ground. Taking it for a sign of providence, he followed it down and found shelter with the Fakatekati family. He stayed for 2 nights, sleeping in a warm, quiet corner, sharing their simple meals and asking Sandor endless questions. Reverend Evans was a man whose words carried weight. He was educated, observant, and trusted by the scattered congregations he served across 3 counties. As he continued his circuit through Chase, Morris, and Lyon counties, he spoke of what he had seen. In his letters to parish leaders and in his sermons, he described the Hungarians' incredible underground home. "He has not fought the winter," Evans wrote in one widely circulated letter, "but has found the Lord's own blanket in the soil. While we shiver above, his family lives in the quiet warmth of the earth itself, burning but a fraction of the wood we require. It is a lesson in humility and wisdom." The story, vouched for by the preacher, became a local legend. That spring, a half-dozen families, having lost nearly everything in the blizzard, came to see Sandor's home. They came not to mock, but to learn. Sandor, a man of few words, taught them by showing them. He explained the importance of digging below the frost line, of building strong walls, of orienting the entrance to the south. By the following autumn, 3 new dugouts, based on his design, were under construction in the region. The prairie doghouse had become the blueprint for survival. Sandor Fakatakuti, with his old-world skills and his profound respect for the earth, had created a structure that was decades ahead of its time. He had built, through intuition and necessity, what modern architects would later call an earth-sheltered, passive solar home. The principles he used, leveraging geothermal stability, minimizing northern exposure, using thermal mass to regulate temperature, are the cornerstones of sustainable design today. He had no technical vocabulary for these concepts, no blueprints or engineering manuals. He simply had the memory of Hungarian wine cellars and the sharp, painful motivation of a brutal Kansas winter. His work was a quiet testament to the idea that the most advanced solutions are sometimes found by looking backward, by listening to the ancient wisdom of those who worked with the earth instead of merely upon it. In the end, the genius of Sandor Fakatakuti's design was its profound simplicity. The American pioneers who came to the Flint Hills saw the prairie as an adversary. They saw the wind as an enemy to be blocked, the cold as a foe to be conquered with a roaring fire. Their story was one of struggle, of imposing their will upon a harsh and unforgiving landscape. They built their wooden forts on top of the grass and fought the winter every year, and often they lost. Sandor saw it differently. He did not try to conquer the prairie. He sought an alliance with it. He understood that the problem was not the cold itself, but the location of his life. The killing cold, the relentless wind. The entire war of winter was a surface phenomenon. A few feet down, there was no war. There was only a deep, abiding, and constant peace. The earth was already warm. He just had to live inside it. He didn't invent a new way to create heat. He found a place where the heat had been stored all along. He didn't build a shelter to escape the prairie. He built a shelter that was part of the prairie. The greatest wisdom he proved was not in fighting the world, but in finding your proper place within it. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past. If you found this story of ingenuity and survival as fascinating as we did, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more stories of forgotten wisdom. And let us know in the comments, what other modern technologies do you think have roots in old, forgotten frontier techniques? This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, though the building techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices common to earth-sheltered dwellings. Any application of these or similar techniques in a modern context should be undertaken in compliance with current building codes, safety guidelines, and local regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.